I'm Metta Spencer, and today we get to go to, I think, Amherst, Massachusetts, to speak with Robert Pollin, who is a professor of economics there at Amherst. And he is also the co-author of a book called Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal. He's a co-author with Noam Chomsky, which must be quite a dual act to perform. They kind of seem to have answered somebody's questions. Good morning, Robert Pollin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and you are in Amherst. I can tell you, you were asking me, was I from Berkeley? I was 45 years ago.
Okay,
And
just catching up.
except that before I came here, I taught at UMass in Boston. So we have something in common. In the days before it was we were in the Salada Tea Building, downtown Boston, because there was no campus yet. And in fact, I've never been to the UMass campus, wherever it is in Boston.
Great.
So I see somebody writing an article called, "Can we have prosperity without growth?" And your answer seems to be negative. And I thought, okay, I want this guy on my team because I need all the help I can get. It seems that most of my friends are followers of Herman Daly and Peter Victor. In fact, Peter's here in Toronto, so I know Peter. But
I know Peter also.
Do you? Okay. Well, most of my friends seem to have the idea that and the argument is obviously very sound, because the world is finite and the resources are finite, and we're using them up faster than we can possibly replenish them if they were replenishable, then we have to stop growing. And that's a pretty sound argument. But I say, look, if we did that, we'd have to get rid of capitalism at least, because as I understand capitalism, what it is you put money out and you loan your money in the hope that you're going to get more money back for it. And so if a company goes to the bank and takes out a loan to start a new enterprise or factory or something, they have to have growth that year in order to pay the bank back with interest, right? Therefore, capitalism absolutely requires growth. And I think that's also a sound argument, but I made it up myself. And so I haven't tried it out on anybody. And I thought I'd try it out on you. And maybe we can explore all of the things that are needed for us to consider in order to appraise your argument that we can have a Green New Deal, and that it does involve growth, and yet we can have sustainability. Yeah. Can we have that conversation?
I'd be delighted to, yes.
All right. If you were starting to give a lecture on why growth is possible, not only possible, but maybe necessary, desirable, and you were facing my friends, what would you tell them?
Well, first of all, I may not have faced your friends per se, but I've been in many, many discussions with proponents of degrowth, including Peter Victor. And I have a high level of respect for Peter. And I've been in touch with other major proponents of this approach. So I have had the conversation. First of all, I would say at the simplest level, no growth is way too general to be really, really useful in terms of what we're facing, in particular with respect to climate change. So if we say that, the most pressing ecological and economic problem is climate change, and I believe that's true, and I think Peter would agree with me, it really means that there are two gigantic projects that are right before us that we have to attack. One is we have to transform our energy system, because burning oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy is responsible for 70 to 75% of all carbon dioxide emissions, which in turn is the primary cause of climate change. The second thing is we have to transform our agriculture and forestry systems because the mismanagement or malignant management of agriculture and forestry is responsible for the remaining 25 to 30% of carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, so there's of course a lot of other things and a lot of complicated details, but that's basically the project. Take the energy side. We have to stop burning oil, coal, and natural gas. And the two alternatives, if we're going to do that, one is to contract the economic activity because we depend on energy for economic activity of all sorts, like keeping your house warm. Or we come up with alternative energy sources. And my view is we come up with alternative energy sources. And so that means let's say, renewable energy and energy efficiency investments actually have to grow massively. So we have a massive expansion of, let's say, solar, wind power, and high efficiency investments. At the same time, we do have contraction, we have degrowth of the fossil fuel industry. So already, just to say growth, no growth, misses this specific issue. And at a comparable level, forestry. Do we want forests to continue to contract, to degrow? Actually, no. We want forest cover to expand. We want that to grow. And at the same time, we want industrial agriculture to contract. And we want cattle grazing territories to contract, because that is the primary driver for deforestation, is creating land for cattle to graze so that we can consume a lot of meat.
By the way, I would disagree with you on that one, but that's a whole different show. Come back another day on cattle grazing.
Okay. We can do it now if you want. But
totally different. I really need to put on 2 or 3 shows about that, because it is, I think big animals are really essential for the health of the soil. And if we don't have them, we're going to be in deep trouble. But that's a whole different conversation.
Okay. No, well, I'm not saying you get rid of it altogether, but I am saying that we don't have to rely on it as intensively as we do right now, and the pressure that it exerts on territory, and that therefore the pressure that it creates to chop down forests.
I quite agree with that, about that. It's just that it's very badly done now. And there are ways of doing it which make the keeping of cattle actually carbon negative, rather than, it would reduce it and store carbon. Mm-hmm. But that's, again, I'm sorry to distract you, but I have a principle here that when I disagree with somebody, I always say so on any issue. Anyway,
I think that's a fine principle, and you should keep it. I'm sure you will keep doing it, whether or not I think it's a fine principle, but I do. I think it's a fine principle. Good. Anyway, okay, so the first problem with this broad concept of degrowth is precisely that it's too broad. Okay, we'll put aside issues around agriculture and forestry and just say, on the side of energy, which is the primary driver of climate change, consuming fossil fuels, we have to build out a whole new energy system, and that's a growth project, and it creates a lot of jobs, and that's healthy. And you can say it's degrowth, but then we are really kind of just mincing words. Something is growing and something else is contracting, which has been the history of economic activity from time immemorial, actually. Okay, so then in addition, if we really are focused around solving the climate crisis, economic contracting general overall economic activity simply accomplishes almost nothing. We just went through an experiment, a natural experiment, which was the COVID recession. Global economic activity contracted 3.5%. Degrowth. We just had a year of degrowth, global degrowth, which, by the way, caused massive unemployment, social dislocation, hunger, all kinds of crises in communities. So I don't see it as being all that good on those grounds. In addition to which, you did get emissions went down. Emissions went down by about 5 or 6% globally.
So the emissions went down more than the growth rate?
Slightly. And here's why. Because the areas of the economy that contracted more are heavily energy dependent. In particular, let's say airlines, any form of travel, transportation. But anyway, look, we had a global depression, and all we got was 5% reduction in emissions. We have to get emissions down to zero. So the strategy of relying on economic contraction as a solution to the climate crisis, it just doesn't work. On those grounds, although I have a lot of respect for people like Peter Victor, I just think that the way that the degrowth proponents are framing this issue is not the most constructive.
Okay, well, as I understand them, they actually want to use a different measure. They don't like GDP.
I don't either.
What, right, because it counts bad things as well as good things, right?
Yeah.
But then if let's say they could come up with some indicator that every country had a measure of, and so you would compare the emissions and other environmental impact against that alternative measure. What would be the meaning of that?
Well, I mean, first of all, with all due respect to the degrowth proponents, the critique of GDP has been around forever. They aren't the ones that thought of it. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of critiques. I mean, feminist economists have been critiquing GDP for decades on the grounds that non-market activity, non-market labor, in particular household labor, is not included in GDP. And this, depending on the country, in terms of time spent doing work, it's 20, 25%, 30% of all work not included at all. And of course, it is mostly women doing that work. So, and then, yes, the ecological critique of GDP, that it counts everything. If you're destroying the environment, that does not count as a subtraction against GDP. If you're burning fossil fuels, that is a positive addition to GDP because it's economic activity that is measured in the market. But the fact that you are polluting the air, polluting the river, causing climate change, not part of GDP. That's been known forever. This is not anything original. Again, it's an accurate point. I myself have been teaching it in intro classes for 30 years. So this is nothing new. Now, if you say, okay, well, let's come up with better measures of economic activity, I'm all for that. But the fact is, if we're talking about climate change, we have to get emissions down. It actually, GDP doesn't really factor in one way or the other. I mean, you can, but the real thing is we've got 34 billion tons of CO2 getting pushed into the atmosphere this year. We have to get that down to zero. That's a real number. GDP is a construct of economists. Emissions are CO2 emissions.
Right. And I think they would agree with you on everything you just said there. But the measure that I didn't know that even the word decoupling until a week ago, until my friend Doug Saunders wrote about it in the Globe and Mail last week and said that there are some countries, I don't know, 20 or 30 countries in the world that have achieved decoupling. And I thought, well, what is that? And but it apparently is a measure of the extent to which you can there's less correlation, at least, between
right
the environmental impacts and the growth. Right now, the measure they always use for that is GDP, and what else could you use? But if you wanted to look at that question, whether or not there's progress being made in reducing, say, emissions or the depletion of resources, you want some standard to measure it against. And growth is the thing that I think in terms of, but if you can't use GDP, how else are you going to find out whether or not you're making progress?
Okay, so again, GDP is a very imperfect statistical construct that attempts to capture the overall level of economic activity in an economy. We could improve it a lot, like putting in household labor, subtracting out environmental impacts, putting in underground activity like the drug economy. I mean, some years ago, I was doing work in Bolivia on macroeconomic policy. And if all we did was look at the official statistics, we'd be missing 35-40% of all economic activity, because 35-40% is the drug trade. So, you can keep burying your head deeper and deeper and deeper into the sand, or you can say GDP isn't good enough. So we could say, basically, you're right. Decoupling is a very important concept. And what it is attempting to get a handle on is the degree to which you can have economic activity expanding while you have emissions going down. And some countries, Sweden, for example, have accomplished this, not to the extent necessary to be fully on a climate stabilization path. Even the US is kind of getting to the point at which this is happening, but to a very modest degree.
Because, as I recall, I now have looked it up, there's relative and absolute decoupling.
Well, so relative doesn't accomplish anything. Relative basically means if you have a GDP, or let's call it good measure of economic activity. So we have a good measure. We got rid of GDP. So we have a good measure of overall economic activity, and it's going up, and our emissions are also going up, but more slowly. That's relative decoupling.
Okay, so that must have been what Doug was referring to when he said there's decoupling, because it's relative, not absolute, that these countries are doing, right?
No. Some of the countries have got to the point where. So let's take Sweden. I don't know what the statistics are this year, but let's say Sweden economy grew by 2%, and let's say their emissions go down by 1%. Well, you have absolute decoupling, because one thing is going up and the other thing is going down. That's an example of absolute decoupling. It is not an adequate extent of absolute decoupling, because what we really want is we need emissions to go down 5-6% per year in order to hit the targets for climate stabilization. Mm-hmm. But the concept is that
when I first read his article, I was thinking absolute decoupling must mean that you've got zero growth, or it's the goal that we have is net zero, but it's not net zero. It's just net less, big time.
It's
less.
Negative. Yeah. Negative on emissions, positive on economic activity.
Okay, but negative, just you still have a long way to go before you get to
zero.
Well,
because we have to be at zero. The most authoritative agency on climate change is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they're part of the UN, and they're mainstream. They're not ultra green or anything, but I mean they've come out and said we have to be at zero emissions by 2050. So we have to, zero means zero. So we can't just keep chipping away tiny amounts. Mm-hmm. We're at 34 billion tons of new emissions every year now. We have to get that down to zero. And so that's very challenging.
But still, there's no way to talk about decoupling without using something like GDP as one of the things in the equation.
There are alternatives to GDP. For example, there's the Human Development Index.
Right, I know, but do any people who are trying to figure out about decoupling, do they ever refer to one of these alternative measures, indicators?
Not that I know of, but it wouldn't be hard to do. You have two variables. So you just bring the two variables together and you plot their relationship. So you could have a human development index as opposed to GDP. Or you could have a modified GDP, which people have also done, which, say, for example, takes account of household labor, takes account of environmental destruction, takes account of the underground economy. Those are the three biggest areas where GDP is inadequate. We have an overall measure of economic activity, whether it's a really good one or an imperfect one. And then we plot that against emissions. And so the point is emissions, whether GDP or any of our measures, whether it's going up or down, emissions have to go down. If we want to save the planet, emissions have to go down. Okay, so what's the strategy?
The Club of Rome and et cetera came out, 30, 40 years before people got worried about emissions. Right. As such. They were talking about resource depletion, right, mostly, I assume. So it looks as if, from all I'm exposed to now, the only things that people are counting now are emissions, not the whole question of resource depletion.
No, I don't think that's fair if we're going to disagree openly, respectfully. If you take somebody like Peter Victor, I think he gives a lot of attention to the other environmental crises, biodiversity loss, ozone depletion, and so forth. So, he's made a point, he's made it to me, that, the degrowth proponents are not only about climate. They're about the full set of issues of environmental impacts that we're facing that are damaging. Our economic activity is damaging or destroying, for example, animal habitats.
Well, we say, I agree with you, that he and my friends who are close to him do talk about these other things too. But in the general discourse, I don't see it as much. But would you say that that in general, if emissions, let's say, are the focus, and if they go down, can you also imagine that the other resources and other environmental things like biodiversity are going to go down too? Or are these necessarily linked, or can you say that, you might have the world come to an end from something we weren't counting on instead of what we've been figuring on?
So in part, I think there are connections. It's not a one-for-one connection. So, for example, if we think about preserving forest areas, that will also maintain biodiversity. Destroying rainforests also destroy animal habitats, plant habitats. So there is that connection. Moreover, related in the area of agriculture per se, if we have organic agricultural practices, regenerative agricultural practices substituting for industrial agriculture, which is very, very heavily dependent on nitrogen fertilizer, which causes emissions, it causes soil depletion. Then again, you also are going to creating opportunities for the regeneration of the soil, which will now enable species to survive much more easily. That doesn't mean that that's the full answer. Eliminating pollution, air pollution, and water pollution is also critical for preserving species. And so, yeah, getting rid of fossil fuel emissions helps, but it's certainly not the whole answer.
Okay, now you have put together a pretty concise statement of how you would go about raising funds for the kind of Green New Deal that should be global.
Yeah.
It looked like just a page or two, which was nice. And I'd like for you to tell us what you would do. But let me start with a one question that has bothered me from the beginning. I love the Green New Deal is what insofar as I've read it, but except that they don't talk about cutting military expenditures.
No.
And you say let's cut military expenditures by 6%. That would give you a good pot of money to use for something else. And I quite agree. But we have this thing called a platform for survival, where we got together and figured out plans. And I proposed, they never accepted it completely, but that we specify how much we want military expenditures to be cut. And I said 80%. And they didn't go for that. I mean, they didn't accept it, although in their hearts they wish it could be possible. But you know, how do you come up with a number, whether it's 6% or 80% cut? How do you justify any particular amount of cutting of military expenditures as the realistic and reasonable and achievable goal?
So, you know, that's the great question, and that's not really what we focused on in the book. The number that I came up with, which thank you for reading it so carefully, was really based on what I had calculated was the overall level of public spending that would be needed to achieve the emission reduction target. And on average, over the next 30 years, globally, it's about $2 trillion per year, which amounts to about 2.5% of global GDP. So the issue of where you'd come up with this money, and really what I presented in the book was meant to be illustrative. It wasn't meant to be, this is the program, it's the only right program, nobody else could ever come up with a better one. It was meant to show, look, the money is there. And so the idea around the military spending, it was one source of funding in combination with three others. One of them was taxing carbon. So you tax the consumption of oil, coal, and natural gas. If you do that, most of the money has to go back to people in people's pockets, because, you know, raising taxes on carbon means people are going to spend more money on their necessities, because energy is a necessity. But then there's still some money left over. I also said eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies amount to about $3 trillion in the global economy right now. So again, I said, take some of that. Most of it has to just go back into supporting people, because like energy subsidies are a way to reduce poverty in a lot of countries by just making it cheaper to buy fuel. Okay, and then the other one was military spending. Now, I agree with you. A 6% cut in military spending isn't that much, especially if we're talking about the U.S., where we have a $750 billion military budget, doing mostly things that are nefarious. So we want to cut that by a lot more. It is, as I said in the little book, I'm just laying out these things as a combination of revenue sources that could be politically feasible. So if we were to say, well, let's cut military spending 80%, I mean, even your friends, I guess, are saying that's unrealistic. Frankly, it is unrealistic. It doesn't mean it's not right. It's just at the moment unrealistic. So I tried to come up with a combination of things that would be significant, that would generate enough revenue and still be somewhere in the realm of political feasibility in today's world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, good. And you talked about another couple of things. This whole thing, let's talk about carbon taxation, because just as, I mean, the two things that I think are politically challenging about your proposal have to do with cutting fossil fuels subsidies and carbon taxation, because that doesn't seem to sell. And although Canada has some, and we have a commitment to increase carbon taxation, but I would, without being good at numbers, I don't know how much I want it to go up, but I think it probably needs to go up a lot faster than we're intending, or the government's intending for it to go. So talk about the feasibility of both of these things in terms of, is Biden ever going to get anywhere with his modest proposals? Or maybe you don't think it's modest. I don't know. What do you think of Biden's proposals? And I don't think he's even trying for carbon taxation, is he?
Yeah. So, we do already have a carbon tax in the sense that when you go to the gas station and you fill up with gas, part of what you're paying is tax. We don't call it a carbon tax, we call it a gas tax, but it's basically the same thing. So we do already have it, and I think every country already has it. In Europe, they're much higher, maybe 2-3 times. To fill up a gallon of gasoline is going to cost you twice as much, and that does discourage consumption of gasoline, and primarily because people get smaller cars that are more efficient, and that's good. So the problem with the carbon tax is that it's a necessity for a lot of people. For wealthy people, it's nothing. So you spend another $8,000 a year on gasoline or all energy. When your income is $1 million, it's nothing. If your income is $30,000 and you're going to spend another $3,000 on energy, that's a massive hit. That's a 10% cut in your standard of living. So that when we do a carbon tax or anything equivalent, most of the money should be returned to people, just income for people. So if you're going to pay, let's say, another $3,000 in energy costs, you're going to get $3,500 back from the government. So that would be a rebate. And that's, in France, President Macron tried to institute a carbon tax on environmental grounds, and there was this huge rebellion, the so-called Yellow Vest Rebellion, because people said, yeah, we want to save the planet, but we also want to not have our living standard go down. Totally reasonable. So the way to design the carbon tax is, as I described very briefly in the book, in the book I said, okay, we're going to have a global carbon tax, and it's going to 75% of the revenue just goes back into everybody's pockets, and everybody gets an equal amount. And the way I calculated it, every single person on planet Earth gets $60 from the way I designed it. Now, $60 for somebody in Toronto, most people, is not going to mean a whole lot. But if you're living in Kenya, $60 is going to improve your living standard. And at least, getting the $60 back in Canada is going to mean that at the very least, you're not going to see your income go down. You're going to pay $60 and you get it back. The point is, it's going to encourage you to look for alternatives, clean energy, where you don't have to pay $60. So the way I designed it, we have this global carbon tax. Most people in the world are actually made better off in terms of their income. Rich people are going to pay a little more. So that's, and then the same principle, in my opinion, should be set out for the fossil fuel subsidies. It's the same idea. It's the government is paying for some of your heating oil or gasoline or electricity. And by getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidy, if your energy source is fossil fuels, well, then it's going to cost more. So the government has to, the revenue that the government has, that it is applying to a fossil fuel subsidy, you take it away, but you give it to people in other grounds. So for example, you pay for them to buy solar energy, or you give solar energy away for free. My co-worker here at UMass, actually an Indian, actually has a paper on India, which says, okay, we have a Green New Deal in India. If you are in the lower 75% of income categories, you get solar energy for free. And it's paid for by getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidies for everybody else, for the well-off people, and through the carbon tax, which is going to hit mostly the well-off people.
How do you, I'm trying to think of how you would, how do you administer a thing like that? Carbon, solar energy, for me, I pay a different rate than somebody down the street because my income's different. How do they know what my income is and how much to charge me? And I don't understand
it'd be very simple. No, it's not that complicated. So what it would just be that, let's say we're going to give out solar energy for free. So everybody is going to get the solar energy for free. Now then, how do we finance the free solar energy? Through the carbon tax. Now the carbon tax, okay, everybody is taxed. Everybody goes buys gasoline, everybody is taxed. But then when you pay income tax, you will get a rebate if you're below a certain income level. So it's that simple.
Oh, that sounds pretty neat. I like that. How could you create, and do you think there's any prospect of being able to have a global tax of any kind, whether it's carbon tax or anything else, a Tobin tax, for example?
I've actually done a lot of work around the Tobin tax and the equivalent financial transaction tax in the United States. And I actually was involved in drafting the bill that Bernie Sanders introduced in the Senate, and former Congressman Keith Ellison introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's probably not happening anytime soon, though it has support, and it's a well-designed tax. It's a good idea because a lot of what goes on in the financial markets is completely worthless. If the premise underlying what's the point of Wall Street? Supposedly, the point is you're mobilizing funds from people who want to save and delivering it to other people who don't have enough, who want to invest and then do good things in the economy. Okay, that's supposed to be the point. But the real point, what really happens, 95% of what happens on Wall Street is speculative trading. It's a casino, it's gambling. And we should tax it. We actually tax gambling casinos at a very high rate. I haven't checked most recently, but somewhere in the range of 10%, or 7, 8, 9, 10%. You go into a gambling casino, you want to spend money and whatever you want to do, but 10% of what you're doing is going to the government. That's extremely high. The tax that, say, Bernie Sanders proposed for the U.S. Economy on Wall Street was 1/2 of 1%, 1/20th of a gambling tax. But it would raise a lot of money, and so it's good because it taxes things that you want to discourage, and it raises a lot of money. Therefore, it's good. But no, I don't, it's certainly not a big priority.
You can't just tax one country.
No, you can do it in one country.
But won't everybody go and do their trading someplace else?
No, and here's why. Let's say we have the tax only in the United States. And let's say I want to buy a stock from you. Well, you're in Toronto, but let's say we're both in the United States, or it doesn't matter. Let's say you own stock in a U.S. company, and I want to buy it from you. Okay, so I give you the $100 to buy your stock, but then I have to pay $1 on tax. And but I'm saying, well, I don't want to pay the $1. So let's do our trade in Canada, or let's do our trade in the Canary Islands. Okay, but here's the catch. If you don't pay your $1 in tax, then that trade is not legal in the United States. So according to US courts, you still own the stock. I haven't bought it. I haven't bought it until I pay the dollar. So that creates this gigantic incentive for people to actually do what they're supposed to do, which is to pay the stock. So that's why, in my view, of course, it would be good to have it on a global scale, but I think it works just fine on a national scale. And in fact, it is functioning at a national level in many, many countries right now, including the UK.
Tobin, there are Tobin taxes working?
Well, not the Tobin, the exact Tobin tax is tax on the on foreign exchange and the currency market.
Right.
But the more general idea of the financial transaction tax can be in domestic financial markets. So, for example, the UK, there is a 0.5% tax on all stock trades, and that's in the world's second biggest financial market. So it does work.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the notion of a $60 rebate for everybody in the world, which means that there would have to be some global treaty or some, I don't know what you would do.
Yes.
How would you implement, I mean, how would you even negotiate a deal like that?
Every country, to my knowledge, already has a gasoline tax, already has a tax on electricity consumption. So let's call them a carbon tax. They already exist.
Okay, but how, I mean, if you say we want it to every country in the world to do it, and I happen to live in Peru and I'm the government of Peru and I say I won't do it, how are you going to make me do it?
So Peru does, I don't know what their tax rates are, but they already have, I'm sure they already have what we would call a carbon tax. So let's say we have an international treaty that says every country has to add 1% to its carbon tax, existing carbon tax, and that additional 1% is going to go into this global pot. And then let's say the countries say, no, well, we don't want to do it. We don't want to be any part of it. Okay, well, if you're not going to be any part of it, then you're not going to be part of any of the resources that are going to be provided in support of building a clean energy economy. And let's say also that, okay, then therefore you're not going to be you're not going to be permitted to engage in trade with the US or China or Canada. So there are various sanctions that can be established that can actually be quite robust.
So the way you'd go about it is just try to negotiate a treaty.
Yeah.
Where would you do it? At the UN or?
Well, we have the World Trade Organization. Mm-hmm. We have the World Bank. We have the IMF. We already have these institutions. A lot of progressive people, such as myself, are very critical of what these institutions do, but we can use them for other purposes. Mm-hmm. Certainly the UN. Mm-hmm. And most of what the UN does not entail binding legislation, but the World Trade Organization does entail binding legislation.
Yeah, all I hear is people dissing it. They don't like it.
Yeah, because they've supported neoliberalism. They are a bedrock of neoliberalism. But that doesn't mean that the institution, okay, they've got in their minds that the world should be run on the basis of neoliberalism. That doesn't mean the idea that you have sit around and you have people deciding on policy is intrinsically bad. In fact, I would say it's good. It's just that we have bad economic models and bad policies. So change the policies. Don't get rid of the institutions.
So the WTO could be used to create a treaty that would impose a global carbon tax.
Sure.
Wow. Well, all right. Let's go for that. I can put some energy behind that idea. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Now, another thing to change the subject a little bit is the question of unemployment. I mean, you don't even bring up the the specter that I hear so many other places of unemployment. But because you seem very sure that this Green New Deal is going to create jobs. And I've heard so many other people warning us that, you know, when truck drivers are no longer employed driving trucks because they drive themselves, etc., and professors don't need to teach because we got programs that do it, then there are going to be a whole lot of us out of work.
One thing we know for sure is that the history of capitalism, and more generally, the history of economic activity, has always entailed the destruction of some industries, some forms of employment, and the creation of others. That's always been the case. 100 years ago in the United States, over 50%, and I think Canada, over 50% of the population was engaged in agriculture. And most of those jobs are gone. We're down to 2 or 3% of the population engaged in agriculture. So if we were going back to that period and we say, what's going to happen? You know, where are these people going to find jobs? Everybody's working on a farm. Well, guess what? They have things to do. They have other things to do. You know, this is not a new issue. I've dealt with it specifically, you know, in the energy sector, and there will be, you know, the fossil fuel jobs will be destroyed. They're going to go away. Of course, we want them to. But we have to transition people into other areas. So building the green economy is one area where they can find jobs. You know, the more general point you're making is artificial intelligence, automation more generally going to destroy employment? Yeah. But it doesn't mean that there won't be other things for professors can still profess. Somebody has to write the programs. Somebody has to talk to the students and grade the papers. And even if it requires less, I mean, if we're at a, you know, overall higher average living standard, then fine, then people have more free time and they'll think of other things to do with their lives rather than working, you know, 40, 50 hours a week. So I think it certainly the transition is a real problem. It's especially the problem if we're living in a world of neoliberalism, meaning extreme inequality, so that if you don't have a job with income, you're in really bad shape. If you have a robust, generous welfare state, then people can live reasonably well without having to rely on working at a job for 40, 50 hours a week.
Yes, and we would say that's something to be celebrated for sure.
Right.
But now, when I, 10 years ago, when I was mostly arguing with my friends about growth economy, I was saying things like, you know, the way things are going, our jobs are mostly more knowledge-based and service-oriented instead of manufacturing. And if this trend continues, and let's say we could make it continue or speed it up further, you know, you and I have not done anything with my hands to produce anything to sell or that anybody is going to actually materially consume. And therefore, I'm not using up the world's physical resources. I spend a lot of time at my computer, which does consume a certain amount of energy, I suppose, but and materials, plastic keyboards and things. But basically, most of my friends are psychiatrists who talk to people, or you know, they do massage on people, or they teach them yoga, or they write scripts for new TV dramas or things like that. And those to me are the solution. You know, suppose I pay you to write a poem for me, and every year you write a new set of poems, and I pay you more each year for your poetry. You haven't done anything to use up the world's resources, but hasn't that increased? Doesn't it count as a GDP growth? And couldn't we say that the solution to the world's problems is to do things that don't involve so much material resources?
I wouldn't go that far because I don't think that the world's problems is at the moment. I wouldn't characterize it as simply using up resources. I think it's too general a way of stating the issues. So I think the most pressing problem is the climate problem, and other issues with respect to general consumption of resources are they're problems, but they're not at the level of urgency, in my view, and that we can also think about ways to utilize renewable resources, for example, bioplastics, plastics based from renewable sources, such as plants, as opposed to being from fossil fuels. Then they're renewable. Then you're not using anything up. And you could have a computer keyboard that was built on the basis of a bioplastic. So, generally speaking, though, you're right that you the trajectory for transitions in economic activity is for more services as opposed to manufacturing and agriculture. So, think about education. So instead of having classrooms with 30 students, we could have classrooms with 12 students, like people with a lot of money spend a lot to send their kids to private schools where you have classrooms with 12 students as opposed to 30 students. So that would effectively mean doubling, roughly, the level of employment in the world of education. Then let's think about people who are in nursing homes. Instead of being in a nursing home with, 35 other people getting serviced by a nurse, for example, you're in a situation where you have a nurse servicing 5 people, and it makes life better. So that would massively expand the employment in the area of healthcare. So those are a couple of examples. And right, they would not entail consuming resources to the extent that, say, driving trucks do.
Well, the way you put it makes, and in my own mind, I was wondering which is the driver of the global consumption use. Is it the employment structure, or is it our consumption structure?
Consumption structure.
It's consumption, yeah.
Well,
So
I mean,
we
of course, people care about employment, but basically, most decisions on economic activity are made by, we're in capitalism, so they're made by private investors. And so private investors are saying, sure, people want to buy McDonald's hamburgers. So how do we supply them with McDonald's hamburgers? So it's the decision to, to supply, make money off of selling McDonald's hamburgers. And then that creates the demand for employment. So the demand for employment is, I guess, what we could call derivative of the demand for goods and services.
Mm-hmm. Okay, to what extent do you think public policy can actually change the direction of preferences, consumption preferences? That is, if how can I've heard, I believe that advertising actually creates. I know it happens to me. I read a lot of Facebook things, and I see something for sale and I'll buy it, but I wouldn't have bought it otherwise. It's clearly advertising that makes me want things. So I believe that. But if we stopped advertising, or if we did some other public policy that would change, make me feel that really what I need to do is spend more time meditating, and I need to hire a guru to teach me how to meditate, because I'm not going to use any consumption of resources for that. To what extent could some general policy about changing our culture affect our preferences and our demand?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's obviously a really, really big question, but Well, I mean, I think just let's take the area of energy, which is the one we started. I mean, we have to change our preferences. We have to move towards a much more efficient use of energy. We have to move towards different ways through which we transport ourselves from point A to point B. On the more general issues, I think that, what's true for relatively privileged people like ourselves is not true for most of the world's population. I don't think most of the world's population is faced with the same degree of choice over should I, buy everything I see on Facebook or not. So to me, that is not the most pressing issue. Is of course we should consume less, those of us that are affluent, and so taxing consumption for non-necessities is something I favor, taxing it at a higher rate. But I want to make sure that we are not imposing on people who are living mostly on the basis of necessities. So,
Okay. Just one last question, which I don't understand bonds. You proposed that this European Central Bank and somebody else issue green bonds. Explain that to me. Are there such things? I mean, do they already issue bonds, or is this something I should have known about and didn't, or what?
So I'm actually not proposing that they issue bonds. I'm proposing that they buy bonds. In other words, lend money. So let's just, again, take an example. Let's say I have a project to set up, well, let's just say I'm going to put solar panels on my roof and I can't afford to pay for them right now, so I want to borrow. So I'm going to borrow money from you, and we're going to have a contract. And we can call it a green bond or we can call it a green loan. That's all it is. That's a green bond. Now, the proposal is that the Federal Reserve, or the European Central Bank, now you're holding that bond and you've given up money to enable me to put the solar panels on my roof. The Fed would buy the bond from you. So you are made whole. You have your money. And part of the reason, or maybe all of the reason, that you're willing to make me the loan in the first place is because you know that you're going to be made whole, because you're going to get paid back by the Fed. You don't have to wait for me to pay you back. So that's basically the principle. And we can think of that municipalities, states, private firms, if they're doing something that is a socially prioritized activity, like putting solar panels on roofs, then the central bank will buy the bonds. Now, keep in mind that, like just over the last year, the Federal Reserve, to bail out Wall Street, bought $4 trillion worth of bonds, not green bonds, any kind of bonds, just to keep the Wall Street firms afloat. So they can easily come up with a couple $100 billion without batting an eye. And so if people, let's say state governments want to invest in a green economy, so they issue bonds. Somebody has to buy the bonds, meaning somebody has to lend them the money. The Fed could do it at a 0% interest rate, and that's more or less what I have in mind.
Perfect. Okay, time's up and a little bit over, but it's been a very good education, because although I never took an economics class, I am going to claim that now I've taken a very good.
You're a total expert now, yes.
Thank you so much. This has been great fun.
Okay, great talking to you.
Bye.
Bye.